1 out of 8 Venezuelans have left the country over the last 20 years. I am one of them. Venezuela is an oil-rich Caribbean country, and at one point, we were expected to become the first developed nation in South America. But in the 80s and 90s, the economy took a downturn. Currency evaluation, exchange control, a banking crisis. As a result, 20 years ago, Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela on a quest to drain the swamp. As an outsider, he claimed the system was the problem. The old political parties, the dangerous media, really anyone who opposed him. After all, how can a system have any credibility when there is rampant corruption and wealth inequality? Chavez became a defender of the poor, the working class, the Chavistas. He promised to defend them against the greedy and powerful elites, the anti-Chavistas. Chavez tried to redistribute the wealth through social programs. His exaggerated nationalism led him to expel foreign capital and investors. And he rejected Venezuelans' traditional allies and turned instead towards the government of other strong men that he admired in Russia, the Middle East, Cuba. Anti-Chavistas complained about his radical actions, disregard of the law, and the damage he was causing to the institutions. When the oil prices dropped and the funds ran out, it became clear that Chavez had failed to change the system and address the structural inequalities. Instead, his lack of economic and political experience had ruined the country. Chavez's authoritarian style was evident from the beginning, even before he was elected. He spread his message in rowdy, unscripted rallies filled with violence, threats, dirty jokes, personal stories. He spread his message on social media and became the world's first Twitter president. He tweeted to taunt his opponents, to brag about the economy, and to promote his favorite TV stations. And he spread his message on TV and became a self-made reality TV star. After a failed strike from the opposition, Chavez fired thousands of workers from the national oil industry on live TV, reading their names one by one and saying, "Está despedido," "You're fired." It was hard for the opposition and the media to find a way to respond to Chavez's larger-than-life persona. There was no option to argue with him using logic. He used conspiracy theories to promote his political agenda. His government reveled in the chaos of fake news and alternative facts. And he manufactured crises to distract away from the issues, changing the name of the country, adding a new star to the flag. In the midst of this chaos, the opposing political parties banded together to lead the resistance. Massive protests flooded the streets of Caracas, our capital. Being a good anti-Chavista, I went to hundreds of protests, hundreds. You couldn't not go. This was the social event you had to be seen at, so your friends and families didn't mistake you for a Chavista. The first time we assembled a crowd of over 1 million people, we thought we had won. Peaceful protests of this size had achieved results in other countries. Surely, the international community would be shaken, and the government would realize it had lost the popular support. As the protests spread around the country, having over 1 million people became the norm. When eventually the government was forced to respond, they did so with their own counter-protests. Chavistas marching against anti-Chavistas, forcing clashes and violence between the two groups. El movimiento estudiantil, or the student movement, was the grassroots response from the universities. We advocated for freedom of speech and in defense of the free media. We wore white to symbolize peace and distance ourselves from all political parties, both from the opposition and the government. We covered our mouths with duct tape to denounce self-censorship of the government-controlled media. And we held our hands high and painted them white to protest against repression and police brutality. We spelled libertad, freedom, on the highway to show the world what we were fighting for. Resistance movements like this came and died, but no real progress was achieved. Instead, Chavez cleverly used the protest to convince his followers that anti-Chavistas were unfair to him, sabotaging his every move and preventing the country from moving forward. He accused us of being paid protesters, foreign agents sent to destabilize his government. Despite lowering approval ratings, Chavez found ways to stack the National Assembly, the Supreme Court, and the military in his favor. With no checks left to his power, Venezuela's economic woes only increased. As poverty grew, so did crime and scarcity of basic goods. Chavistas and anti-Chavistas alike began to see immigration as the only option. Anyone that could applied for jobs or school abroad. I was lucky I was one of them. 10 years into Chavez's presidency, I left for graduate school in Michigan, wondering when or if I would ever go back. I haven't. Despite his economic failures, Chavez managed to cling to power until his death because of his charismatic persona and his uncanny ability to guide elections towards the right results. Even though he was first elected through fair and free elections, once in power, what started as a manipulation of the voter registration eventually evolved into complete control of the electoral system by his ruling party. A year after his death, a worldwide campaign was launched using the hashtag SOS Venezuela. Millions of Venezuelans, many of us now living abroad, marched simultaneously in 52 countries, including our little group here in Buffalo. The hashtag and the protest were to shine a light on the violence, human rights violations, censorship, corruption, hyperinflation, and scarcity of basic goods that have ravaged Venezuela. These protests led to more repression and even more political prisoners, but still no real progress was achieved. It's 2018, 20 years after Chavez's election. His broken promises affect all Venezuelans, whether Chavistas or anti-Chavistas. His hand-picked successor remains in power, but continues to lose support. Protests and counter-protests are still happening today, both groups growing more radicalized. Life for Venezuelans is defined in black and white by politics. Relationships are broken and lost over politics. How could you be conciliatory while living a life of unbearable hardships? On average, Venezuelans have lost 24 pounds in the last year due to hunger. No one could have predicted this. Venezuelans never imagined our lives would be like this today. 50 years ago, people from all over the world were moving to Venezuela, looking for a better life, better opportunities. 20 years ago, when Venezuelans started to leave the country, we were doing it with options. It was a choice, our choice. Today, Venezuelans are leaving with no hope, no money, no job prospects. They leave towards the closest border, walking by foot, because they can't afford the cost of a bus ticket. And they leave, causing a migrant crisis with Colombia and Ecuador, who do not have the capacity to handle such large numbers of refugees. Venezuela's story is not unique, not in Latin America, not in the world. My grandmother, who grew up in World War II Germany, always said that Chavez's rhetoric reminded her of Hitler's. There are many other examples. Populist leaders all sound the same, whether they're right-wing or left-wing. Populism is an ideology aimed at creating discord between two groups, pairing the silent majority against the elites. Populism creates a barrier, an us and a them, Chavistas and anti-Chavistas, a polarization of the country. So how do we face a populist president? In Venezuela, the opposition played directly into the populist game. Instead of acknowledging that Chavez's election was a result of valid concerns, they fought hard to maintain the status quo. According to the opposition, an entire half of the country was now the problem, rather than just the one individual giving them a voice. In turn, it was easy for Chavez to label the opposition as the problem and show his supporters that he had been right about us all along. 20 years later, both groups remain at a standstill. So how do we face a populist president? It is hard to walk the fine line between speaking up, standing for what is right, and listening, not alienating ourselves from those who think differently. Time and distance allow me to do this for Venezuela now. But over the last 3 years, I found myself being dragged back to those same patterns when it comes to US politics. When the protests started in the US at the beginning of last year, I became one of the organizers of the Buffalo March for Science. This was the first time that I organized a protest, not just participated. And for a few months, we felt so energized, so invigorated. Not just in DC, but here, in Buffalo. Over the last 2 years, some of these movements have maintained their momentum, like the Women's March. Some have fizzled, some new ones have appeared. But after the many, many setbacks that have followed, we may feel now like some of this energy has been lost. So then how do we face a populist president? There's another movement happening mostly underground that is more unique, more powerful, and that fills me with the most hope. Many of the groups that sprouted to organize the satellite marches are evolving. Most of these groups are led by younger people. They identify as nonpartisan, recognizing the injustices inflicted by both parties. They have diverse leaderships reflecting the whole country. And they're not trying to go back to a pre-2017 US, but looking forward instead. These groups are forming an organic network, working in parallel in every city of the country. And even though there's some connectivity between them, they're all working independently at the local level. They're built on the hope that the most change can be done in our communities, working directly with our people and our local governments. Working where we have far more influence than at the national level. Working within the framework of the US, that power is distributed. One of these groups is the Buffalo March for Science. We've evolved into a nonprofit organization called Science Demands Action. We've looked at issues such as the opioid crisis, the impact of immigration in Western New York, and the best policies surrounding single-use plastics. We collaborate with schools, universities, industries, other nonprofits, and our local representatives and agencies. We haven't stopped protesting. There is still very much a need for protests. But besides the Buffalo March for Science, we also organize workshops, lectures, policy research groups, mentoring programs, and the Buffalo Science Festival. This is a celebration of science, an opportunity for families to interact with science-based groups in our community, to learn about the many, many initiatives in our area, and to find something concrete they can get involved with. Because it was a festival and not a march, we were able to connect with people who were not interested in protesting. We were able to reach outside of our base to a larger audience and facilitate discussions that wouldn't happen otherwise. We're not the only ones. Buffalo Engineering Awareness for Minorities, or BEAM for short, is another local group doing amazing work in our community. BEAM prepares underrepresented students for careers in science, technology, engineering, and math. BEAM is a collaboration between local volunteers, small businesses, larger corporations, the University at Buffalo, and the Buffalo Public Schools. All it takes is just 2 hours on a Saturday for our mentors to guide students through hands-on activities, help with homework, and building robots. These experiences are changing the students' lives, providing them with technical skills, self-confidence, scholarships, and opportunities to attend college. These are just 2 groups out of the many, many in Buffalo and all over the country fighting for real progress. Cities and institutions are pledging to meet the climate goals of the Paris Agreement when the American government won't. State laws can provide protections when federal laws won't, for non-discrimination, women's rights, civil rights, environmental issues. These are all examples of what we can advocate for in our communities to bring about real progress. So how do we face a populist president? When we feel like control has been taken away from us and our democracy is in danger, our first instinct is to fight back with everything we have, like we did in Venezuela. But it didn't work there. Let's not repeat that same mistake here. Let's listen instead. What's the actual issue? Is it fear of no savings, no retirement, no social security? Was free trade really great for everyone? And what does a complete career change really look like at 50? And when protesting, ask yourself, who is your audience? What are you trying to convince them of? Is a march the best way to reach them? And once you reach them, how can you use that energy to fix a problem and not just address the symptoms? So how do we face a populist president? We fight for better solutions, not against worse ones. Thank you. And one more thing. Don't forget to vote. Thank you.